Okay, hi everyone. Good evening. I'm Debbie Schwartz, founder of Road to College and the Paying for College 101 group. And I am here tonight with Terry Cowdrey. I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping stuff before we get started and make sure everybody is coming in from the waiting room. Let me just, yep, okay. So here, Terry, I'm going to spotlight you.
Okay.
And then I will spotlight myself so that it's easier for people to see us. Great. Okay, so thank you everyone for coming tonight. These are technically Zoom meetings. I always kind of say this if you come on and you watch a few of our sessions. And the reason why I mention that is because if you have a question, it's fine. If you want to, there's actually a little way you can do a virtual hand raise. If you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, we're perfectly fine with that. You can also put any questions in the chat. But if you don't have anything to say, it's best if you can keep yourself muted, and you came in muted. So, if you don't want to ask a question, it's better to just keep everything the way it is. If you want to put your video on, it's always nice to see people's faces. So it kind of makes it a little bit more enjoyable for Terry and me to just look out and see a few faces instead of seeing, black squares, but that's up to you. And this is recorded, and we will send a link to the recording tomorrow. I see a few people turning on their videos. Thank you. And the last thing is, it's always nice to know where people are watching from. If you want to tell us what state you're in, what year in high school your student is in. I know just from honestly the people who have registered, we can kind of see it's a whole range. We have some families here with the class of 2020, let me think about this, 7, and class of 2026 and class of 2025, which of course, if you have a rising senior in the class of 2025, you're like all over this, right? By this time of the summer. So glad to see everybody is here. So let me just introduce Terry a little bit. And then, Terry, if you want to share anything more about your background, but we've done a few sessions with Terry. She's a former Dean of Admissions and Financial Aid, spent a long time at St. Lawrence University and then Colby College. And then how long has it been, Terry? Maybe for the past 10 years, you've been consulting with lots of colleges on their enrollment management strategy. So you've seen even more than from the original, places that you spent a lot of time at.
Right.
So we love having your experience. And honestly, and I tell everybody, I love the way you can so concisely explain things. So that's very helpful for parents. Okay, so let's get started. I am going to share some slides. Terry's going to, explain how the admissions process works, kind of, having been the Dean of Admissions for so long, working with so many colleges, she has a really good insight about how colleges operate. Again, feel free to put your questions in the chat. Depending on what the question is, I may or may not interrupt Terry at that moment, but we'll be looking through the questions, definitely at the end and try and answer as many as possible. So let me share my screen. And then Terry, if I'm not moving fast enough, you'll let me know.
That sounds great.
Okay, can you?
Welcome everyone. It's great to see you or to know you're out there from a lot of different places and with students in many different parts of this process throughout the high school years. And so, as Debbie said, I've been doing college admissions for a very long time, including serving as the vice president for enrollment at 2 different colleges, and I've worked at places that are very selective and places that are much less so. So I hope that some of the information I can share tonight will be helpful to you. We can go to the agenda. We're going to talk first about what motivates the colleges. I think sometimes families, particularly those who may be going through this for the first time, sometimes families where the parents haven't had the opportunity to go to college or went to university perhaps outside of the US, need to understand a little bit more about what's motivating the colleges. Then I'll talk about holistic admissions, which is a term that's fairly common in this process, particularly at selective colleges. And then share some information about identifying colleges that want your child. And really what I'm talking about there is not only they want to admit them, but are also perhaps interested in providing them with some merit scholarship that will make the price more affordable. So first we'll talk about what motivates the colleges. It may sound a bit harsh, but colleges are at their heart self-interested. They're institutions that are run by boards of trustees, and in some cases with public universities with influence from the state legislature. But the colleges really across the board, they want to maintain or improve their reputation, right? So they're doing everything they can, and some of you know this from the emails that you receive or the paper mail that your child has received these last couple of years. They market themselves. So they're trying to drive up interest in the school because the more popular they are, the more selective their admissions process will be. Certainly, they also always want to enroll students who, through the talents that the students bring and the achievements that they will have while they're in college, will bring positive press to that college. They want to enroll the students who are going to win Fulbright grants upon graduation. They want to enroll students who are going to be presenting at conferences, student athletes who are going to be winning championships. Positive press is something that the colleges are all very happy to have. And then they want to maintain or increase their wealth, right? And that's both through student revenue and through donations. There are colleges in this country whose endowments could allow them to not charge any money for tuition. But that's not something they're going to do when they're thinking about stewarding their funds for the long, looking at the long game. They want to make sure that they're using their funds to well support their students and their faculty, but they also want to continue to increase their wealth. And certainly donations to colleges are often, can really be, you could pretty much graph the donations to colleges related to, and the endowments at colleges related to their popularity. So those are all things that colleges are interested in doing. This is not necessarily bad for students, right? Much of what the colleges do through their own self-interest is also really good for the students who go there. So it's not something to think of negatively, but it's context, I think, that can be helpful. On the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about the admissions process. So again, I talk about popularity. The more popular a college is, the more students that apply, right? That's the sign of popularity. The more students are denied, and that leads to selectivity. So I'll use the example a few years ago when Villanova won the basketball championship. Their applications shot up. Villanova hadn't changed in any way from one year to the next year in terms of what it was offering to its students. But more students were aware of it because of the acclaim they received. And so there is always a drive to increase popularity because it allows the college, assuming they're going to stay the same size in terms of their enrollment, to in fact deny more students. And that leads to being more selective. And in sort of the American culture, the harder something is to attain, usually the more desirable people think that it is. And so selective colleges, the most selective colleges, if you visit them with your sons and daughters, you will find that your children are always encouraged to apply. They won't be doing a presentation and say, well, really, if you don't have at least these certain academic criteria, don't bother to apply. They will instead say, oh, we encourage you all to consider us, you all to apply, because you never know what might happen. We use a holistic process, which I'll talk more about in a moment. But again, it's the notion that they want more applications, not necessarily that they're going to enroll more students. And it's a question you can ask when you're visiting colleges. When you think about the size of a particular college, you can ask, is there an intention to increase the enrollment here? What's the plan over the next few years? Most colleges, particularly in current times, are not planning to increase enrollment because the number of high school graduates in the US is declining. It will plateau in a few years, but it's still not a time of growth in high school, so it's not a time for growth in colleges. The more selective a college is, so again, the more popular a college is, the less they need to award merit money in order to influence students to enroll. Think about that for a moment. So if a school is very, very popular, families are going to choose that college, even if it means stretching more financially than they might be comfortable doing. And so the colleges that are most popular are typically, not always, and not in every case for every student, but they're typically less generous. They award fewer merit scholarships and fewer high amount scholarships because they honestly just don't need to. It's not a criticism of your child. And in fact, at one of the colleges where I worked, the philosophy was just getting in is being admitted is what the family should feel proud of. There was not going to be merit scholarship awarded on top of that. We'll move on to the next slide and talk a little bit about, again, holistic admission, which I've mentioned already. Really what holistic admission describes is it just describes considering many factors, both the objective factors, the grades, the courses a student has taken, the trend of grades throughout high school, the test scores if they're submitted, but also subjective information, recommendation letters from teachers, the essay that the student writes, the kinds of activities a student's been involved with. So holistic admission uses many factors to determine which students to admit. The reason it's used, or one of the reasons it's used, is that the most selective colleges receive far more applications from academically qualified students than they can ever admit. Quite a number of years ago now, I was doing a panel presentation in Westchester County and at a high school, and there was a wonderful admissions person from Harvard on the panel. And she explained to the audience there that they had more valedictorians, students who ranked first in their class, in their applicant pool than they had students in their first year class. And so schools that are receiving so many qualified, academically qualified applicants use holistic review to help winnow that applicant pool down, to choose among the talented academic students. We can move to the next one and then we can see if there are questions at this point. But to just give you a visual of the holistic review process, the items in yellow are really about sort of determining the academic qualities of the student, how prepared they are, what their intellectual ambition may be by what grades they've taken, the challenge of the courses, the test scores, as I mentioned, always reviewed in the context of that high school. So the green circle shows the high school profile, which helps the admissions staff understand what is available at the high school where the student is enrolled and how has the student availed him or herself of what's available. And then the personal review is more, again, the letters of recommendation, the LOR as we abbreviate it, the essays, and the extracurricular activities and experiences the students have had. And you can see by the sort of relative size of the circles that the academic review looms much larger than the personal review. That is really, in many ways, the first bar that students must pass over in order for them to then move into that holistic review where the personal qualities really come into play. To show you a little bit about that, well, let me do a couple more slides before we go to questions. But I've tried to illustrate what the academic review involves. And that really is, first and foremost, can the student handle the academic rigor that they're going to face at the college? When colleges make admissions decisions, they're admitting students who they want to have great confidence will be graduating in 4 years, or certainly in 8 semesters, whether they're all in a row or not, and who will take good advantage of the academic opportunities at the college. And so students then sort of are given, it's called different things at different colleges, but an academic score, an academic evaluation in the review process. The grades earned, the courses taken, as I mentioned before, the trend of the grades is very important. The rigor of the curriculum, and then again, for some students at some schools, we'll have test score results. We'll have letters of recommendation. But a student has to really we're not even going to consider further a student who doesn't have an academic score, so to speak, that puts them at least into the satisfactory category. And what you'll find is the students who are at the top, the outstanding academic students, will typically take a direct route to admission. There won't be a lot of consideration of, gee, what activities were they involved with, or other kinds of things, because they're just so superior academically that they kind of can take the sort of shortcut to being offered admission. When a student is strong or satisfactory, then that's when the holistic review really comes into play. One of the things I should mention, and I know there are lots of families who homeschool students, and that can be a challenge when you're thinking about letters of recommendation or even the way the transcripts are presented. I always encourage homeschool students to get the specific information from the colleges about their process. Some colleges that have test optional programs do require standardized tests from homeschoolers. Some will ask that there are 2 letters of recommendation from adults outside of the family. Perhaps it's a scout leader or a leader of a youth orchestra or an employer. But each school has such different homeschool admission policies that it's important, I think, to make sure that you don't miss out, or that your child doesn't miss out just because you're not aware of a particular college's program or requirements for students who are homeschooled. We'll move on to the next slide and give you a sense of a couple of different applicant pools that may help make this a little bit more tangible. So you have a school, a hypothetical school with 30,000 applications, and that's not an unusual number for large universities these days. If 15,000, half of those students, are considered strong or outstanding academically, they have passed the academic review and they move on for more consideration. And so then the hard part comes for the admissions staff, because that's where they're bringing a lot of subjectivity to evaluating some of the personal qualities, the essays, the extracurricular activities or hobbies or part-time jobs that students have had. And that, in this particular school, brings that number now down to 1,800 students out of 15,000 that have made it through both academic review and personal review. But at this particular college, we can't admit 1,800 students because we don't have room for that number of students or the number we expect to yield from that group. Perhaps at this school, they traditionally yield about 1/3 of the students that they admit, but they don't have room for 600 students, so they can't admit 1,800. 1,400 of those 1,800 had such high marks academically and personally from the staff that reviewed them that they've gone right into the admit bin, as we call it. So 1,400 of the 1,800 are outstanding. They're going to be offered admission. The other 400 of the 1,800, again, they've all passed the academic and personal review. We'd like to take them all, but those 400 go to a committee review where there are a group of people who just talk about those qualities, talk about what the college is valuing, what the college's priorities are in that given year. And of that group, they end up admitting 250 of the 400 that they discuss, and 150 go on to the wait list. I have been in college, I've worked at colleges like this, where those 150 who are on the wait list, some of them are our very favorite students who we really hope will have a chance to come to our college. But until we know how many of that 1,650, the original 1,400, and then the 250 we took from committee review, till we know how many of those are going to say yes to us, we don't know whether we're going to have room for any of the students that we've placed on the wait list. Some years we might have room for 20 from the wait list. Some years we might have room for none. I've worked at schools where we've admitted 2 from the wait list. And so this is the case where this is a school with a 5.5% admit rate. This is rarefied air. There are very few colleges that have a single-digit admit rate. But you could probably, most of you on this call tonight could name them because they are the most popular and often the most well-known of a lot of the American colleges. I'll go through one more case study that is a little bit more reasonable. On the next slide, we have a
Terry,
school.
can I just ask
Sure,
a quick question about the wait list? Can you add any more information about the wait list? Like, are students ranked, or I mean, how do you decide if you have a few extra, spots?
That's great.
How do you decide even from the wait list?
So the general approach to wait list at the colleges I've been involved with, and at this point I've worked at over 25 schools, either as a consultant or a full-time staff person. The wait list is typically not ranked because we don't put in that extra work, frankly, before we know whether we're going to be able to admit anyone. And then when we find out shortly after May 1st that there is room to admit students, there are a number of factors that come into play. At some colleges or universities in particular, there might be room to admit some students from the wait list into the engineering school, but not into the College of Education. And so the major can have an influence. At some schools, there's a desire to balance out gender, and so that can have an influence. At some schools, are the students who have sent us some additional information that's actually helpful. And by that, I mean, they've sent us third quarter grades where they've shown a strong improvement, or they've received an outside honor, or there's something else that has materially changed in their application. And so, excuse me, that might help bring to our attention a student from the wait list. And honestly, at some schools, it's going to be whether the student needs financial aid. That many of the students who are admitted from the wait list, when there's space to admit them, will be the students who need less financial assistance because the college may already have expended on the original students that they've offered admission to what they have available for aid. So we don't rank them ahead of time because, again, some years we can't admit any of them, and that would be work for no purpose. But we do look at quite a few different factors when we're in a situation where there is room on the wait list. I will also tell you, there are lots of times where we will admit a student from the wait list, say on May the 5th, and the student will say, thank you very much, but I've really gotten excited about X other college, and they certainly can continue with their plans to go to that other school. So it's not a 1-for-1. A student staying active on a wait list is not making the college any promises about their plans to attend.
So unfortunately, it's just like another case where you're never really going to know, what the reason was for either, getting off the wait list or staying on. And so maybe in some ways it's good. It's just not something you really, in some way, shouldn't spend too much energy worrying about it because you can't control it.
Right. It's a good point. I'll show you one other process. This one may be a little bit less intimidating than the first one, but this is a small liberal arts college that gets 5,000 applications. 4,000 of the 5,000 pass the academic review. So this is a school that students who are not academically qualified, they're just not applying. This is a self-selected school where the students who are applying to a large extent are all outstanding students. So those 4,000 applications then go through the personal review process. And half of them, 2,000 of them, are very desirable to the college. And so at that point, another 50%, 1,000 of that 2,000 are so outstanding, they go right into that admit group. But the other half, the other 1,000, go into committee review. And it's the committee's task over the course of about 3 weeks to review those 1,000 files and choose 400 of them to be added to the admit group. And 600 of them then are on the wait list. And so, again, this is a school that now is accepting 1,400 out of 5,000. So it's a much higher acceptance rate at 28% than the first school that I showed. But it doesn't really strike me that it's a much easier process for young people because they're still in a situation where their fellow applicants are all very, very talented. And so it is a matter of the fact that their records put them in a good position to be applicants, but there's no guarantee that as they go through this process, they'll be among that group of 1,400 who are selected ultimately. I will say one more thing about the wait list with this example. I've worked at schools where we would put about 600 students on the wait list, and when we would offer that option to students, it was not at all unusual for about half of them to say no thank you right away. So even when we said to them, would you like to remain in active consideration for possible admission to our college, they would say no thank you, I've made other plans. And so immediately that wait list cut itself in half. And now we're talking about 300 students. Again, that's a big number if you only have the opportunity to admit 20 of them, but it's still something where it's important to know that there are times where the students are choosing whether to keep going down a certain path or whether they're going to make alternate plans and take up a school on its offer that maybe made them a great offer and maybe a great merit scholarship offer right out of the gate. Because typically, again, if you're a student being admitted from the wait list, you may receive need-based financial aid, but you're certainly less likely to be in consideration for merit scholarships at that point.
So Terry, I just want to point out two things, and then there are some questions. One is, and you didn't say this exactly, but you said it in previous conversations that we've had, the idea that students that are accepted generally do go through this holistic review.
Yes.
So, so the admissions officer or the admissions team is kind of looking at everything. So you can kind of, feel comfortable about that if you're accepted. But the reality is, if you're denied, you're not getting that holistic review because you're probably kind of getting pushed out before they even get to see the essay or spend the time on the extracurriculars.
Debbie, you're absolutely right. I have often said a school that practices holistic admission does not necessarily and rarely practices holistic denial. So it's important to understand that those personal characteristics, the quality of the essay, the strength even of the letters of recommendation, are not going to always be considered when the answer is no, because the transcript particularly, but the academic profile in totality is really what is going to get students over that first selection bar and into that holistic review that happens. It is, again, simply a matter of, I used the word winnow before, winnowing, sorting. One of the reasons why some of the colleges have returned to requiring test scores is test scores are an incredibly helpful sorting device. because you have students at all different high schools from around the world with all different grading systems. And the test score as a standardized piece of data does allow for sorting. I'm not defending the test score's validity, but I do think it is a tool that is used when there are thousands and thousands of applications being considered.
So the other reason why I wanted to bring up that point, and this is particularly for families who have, rising seniors, and you're in the midst of reviewing the college lists and what schools should your student really apply to, is be realistic. Meaning, if there are these reaches on the list and your student is really, not even in the 50th percentile of either, probably the test score, then the reality is, they're not going to get past the academic review. They're not going to have their essay reviewed, and they would have spent all this energy and time, writing essays. There's some questions about supplemental essays, and it's I hate to say it could just be wasted. So just think about that. You may never really know what they get looked at, but if your student is clearly not in the academic realm of that school, and even though you want to think, oh, it's a reach, maybe if they read the essay, they'll change their mind. That's probably just not going to be the case.
Debbie's exactly right. The other thing I would say is, in the prior example, it was a 5.5% admit rate. That's not for everybody, in that there are going to be certain students that college is going to be admitting that's going to take up some spots in that class. And we often refer to them as hooks in the admissions process. Certainly recruited athletes are a hook. At some schools, alumni children are a hook. At other schools, large donors are a hook. And so for the non-hooked student, the regular applicant, it might be a 2% admit rate, not a 5.5% admit rate. And I think often students think, well, gosh, I have, I think they think of it in some ways as a lottery, but they also think they have a better shot at winning that lottery than I think in most cases the numbers bear out.
Mm-hmm. So Terry, there's a few questions about financial aid forms, and particularly kind of related to if a family fills out FAFSA, if they fill out CSS profile, is that information sometimes considered as part of the admissions process, or does that vary from college to college? Like, about how much need a family might need, or just the opposite, whether that family can actually pay in full?
So it varies from college to college, but at many schools it is considered. I would describe it as not uncommon for it to be considered near the end of the admissions process. So the very, very top students, whether they are able to pay the full cost or they need full financial aid, are likely to be offered admission because the college, as I said, wants to enroll students who, through their achievements, are going to bring positive acclaim to the college. But as they go through that process and they're making some of those final decisions, perhaps, for example, in the committee review, there may in fact be times where there's that a reference to how much financial aid does this family need, that sort of thing. I think it's something, again, that you have to be almost an anthropologist once your child decides where to apply to be able to figure out each college. So, for example, there are a couple of colleges that state very boldly on their websites that if you don't apply for financial aid as a first-year student, you are not able to apply for need-based aid for the subsequent years.
Right, which is important, really important to know.
Absolutely. And because they're afraid that families are bringing together the resources for the first year, thinking it'll help this child gain admission, and then turning around and not having resources available for years 2, 3, and 4.
And to be fair to the college, I imagine they need to budget. So then they can't budget for those subsequent years.
Right. So it's some of those things that are important. I do want to say one quick thing, though, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a moment, but on average at private colleges, in the US, the admit rate is over 60%. That's 60%. What we're talking about right now with these examples that I've shown you are a very small number of colleges that have this kind of selectivity, this sophisticated an admissions process, etc. They often are the schools that are most popular. So I feel like it's important for families to know. At the same time, part of my goal tonight is to also help you think about kind of erasing your mind about colleges you may be really familiar with, particularly through just kind of the popular press, and start thinking about where are the colleges where my son or daughter is going to really be valued, and where in fact some of their achievements may be recognized through a merit scholarship that allows for this to be a reasonable cost, while the student also, because they're at the top of the heap in that particular college, gets a lot of attention from faculty, can maybe be in an honors program, and has a lot more opportunity as an undergraduate than they might if they were kind of in the middle to the bottom of the group admitted at a school that has many, many superstars. So it's important to know there are lots of colleges out there where this kind of selectivity is just not part of their process at all. But they're less popular. It doesn't mean they're providing less of a quality of an experience for the students who go there.
So, Terry, two quick questions and then we'll move on. And I know that there are other questions and we'll circle back to them. One person's asking, does the admissions office share these types of numbers that like we've presented here?
So many colleges do. So there are a couple of ways in which you can get this information. One of the ways, and since this is recorded, you'll be able to get this information if you listen to it, but if you go to iPad, so a website that's called IPEDS, IPEDS, and I believe it's ipeds.gov, G-O-V, you can get publicly reported data that the colleges are required to report that gives you information about their application numbers, their admit rates, etc. In addition, many colleges will publish usually on their admissions page, something that's called the class profile. And the class profile will tell you the number of applications, the number admitted. I'll use the example when I worked at Vanderbilt and we had 4 different schools, we would break it down. So you knew how many applied to the School of Engineering and were admitted and enrolled, how many applied to the School of Music, were admitted and enrolled, and then what the academic profile was for those groups. And so it allows you as a parent, and certainly allows your sons and daughters to say, okay, well, this place admitted 50%. I always use the example at Vanderbilt when I was there, it was a long time ago now, but our academic profile of our engineers was higher than our arts and science students. But we admitted a much higher percentage of our engineering applicants because they were self-selecting in even choosing to apply to the School of Engineering. So it's important to be able to look not only at what are the numbers, what are the percentage admitted, but what does the academic profile look like in terms of GPA, in terms of standardized test scores. Even if the school is test optional, they typically will report some test scores. So school profile or class profile on a college's website, or the ipeds.gov website where you can put a college in and get that information.
I'll actually give a third place, and that is the common data set for the college. And honestly, that might be the best because just because of the lag time. iPads tends to be like 2 years behind, but the common data set would be like kind of just the past or like a year behind. So, and just to make it clear, in all of those resources, you'll be able to probably see total number of applications, usually broken out by male, female, total accepted and total, or total admitted and then total accepted. You're not going to see how many, got through the academic review or how many went to committee. That you're not going to see that level of detail. Just wanted to make that clear. And then there was one other question about, is the process that you're discussing, do you think it's similar or different between private versus public universities or schools?
So my experience has been largely private, but when I worked at the University of New Hampshire, so UNH is the flagship school for the state of New Hampshire, and we had two admissions processes, one for in-state students and one for out-of-state students. And the academic qualifications of the students was very similar in many ways, because you never wanted a professor, for example, in class to be able to know, well, this must be an in-state student versus an out-of-state student. But the level of selectivity, we were always going to be making a commitment to our state residents. So if there were students who were of similar quality, there was a benefit to being an in-state student. At the same time, now schools like UNH and UVM, and there are a number of others of them, that have relatively small populations in state, rely heavily on their out-of-state students to fill their classrooms. So it's not necessarily a negative to be an out-of-state student, but I know that I believe it's the University of Virginia, and I think there are some others that have actually legislative determination about the minimum percentage of the class that must be filled by state residents. So again, the private schools have more autonomy in how they do things, but at the most popular public universities, there still can be a great deal of competition based on, again, the particular school and the fact that they have a commitment to their in-state students. One other thing I just think is important for you all to know, the applications for admission are read by a whole variety of people. And more, particularly at the large universities, it's professional readers that are reading the applications. So these are people who are hired on a seasonal basis to read applications and make at least preliminary decisions on students. When I worked at GW, George Washington University, a few years ago, we had about 24 outside readers who we hired and a staff person managed as we worked with them. Admissions officers certainly at most colleges are doing a good deal of the reading. And then there are schools where faculty are involved with the reading of applications, particularly for honors programs or for particularly selective types of programs, accelerated med school admission, as an example. Faculty get quite involved. So it's a mixed group of people who could be reading your son or daughter's application, which is just something for them to be aware of as they go through the process.
And how are professional readers, hired, or what are their backgrounds usually?
Different schools have different rules. A lot of schools have the rule that you cannot be working at a high school, for example, or as an independent educational consultant and be a application reviewer for that college. A lot of the people who are application readers are either graduate students or are retired admissions staff or retired guidance counselors, retired teachers. I've seen varying degrees of training, though I would say that it's relatively, it's in the college's self-interest to train folks well and to monitor their work. And so what you gain from that I think is important is most of the schools that hire outside readers, those outside readers might be reading 600 to 800 applications. So they have a lot of context. This is not an outside reader who reads 20 applications and then goes and works, second shift doing something else. These are people who during those months of the year when application review is taking place, they're really putting in a lot of time and are very immersed in the application review process.
And actually, somebody kind of asks a question similar to that about how much time is spent reviewing an application, kind of, I guess, if it gets past that academic review.
So there are a couple of different ways that colleges approach that. I would say that so some colleges, it's a single read and a decision is made up, down, or in the middle. And usually, again, that up, down would be they pass the academic review, so they're moving on for that holistic personal review. And the down would be they don't pass the academic review. Some places there are 3 readers on an application. So it really depends on the individual school. I would say that, we typically would say that a first read is usually 10 minutes. And I would say there's probably been pressure in recent years to shorten that. So I would, if it's a school where it's a double reader situation, there might be 15 total minutes spent on an application. If it is a single reader, it could be 5 to 10 minutes on an application, which is heartbreaking sometimes to the students who might be spending hours on preparing the application. But I also feel like you want to know the truth. And when you just do the math of the number of applications that these colleges are receiving and the time frame in which they have to review the applications, I think then it makes sense to you that it would be a very brief amount of time. It's one of the reasons why the Common App has become so popular, with now over 600 colleges using it, is because all of the information is presented in a singular format. As someone who started in this profession when students still filled out their applications with a pen, it's a very different process now to read applications. Personal review, just wanted to hit on a few things here. I think sometimes people think this is only about the essay or only about the activities a student does in school. I think the really important thing to understand here is this is where the word holistic really fits. We are looking at the student's personality, their character, their values as conveyed through the choices they've made in what they write their essay about, in what the recommenders say about them, in the activities or how they spend their time. Part-time jobs, summer jobs, volunteer work are all just as valuable as being on the soccer traveling team or being in the all-county orchestra or certainly being president of student government. Activities are school, community, and family. There are some students who have a wonderful out of the classroom involvement and they do almost nothing at school, but they're very involved in their religious organization, or they're really involved with scouts, or they've had a great part-time job for several years, or an internship that they get. And certainly the special talents that students have. And I listed athletic, artistic, and then I threw debate in there. And there are other things I'm sure that should be there. At some schools, it's speech and debate, but there are things, maybe it's Model UN, and the school has gone on to competitions outside of the school itself, or mock trial, or those kinds of things. So I think the important thing is band is not better than student government, is not better than volunteer work, is not better than being a cashier at the grocery store. All of those things say something about how a young person is contributing to their own growth, to their family, to their community. One of my favorite students from years ago was a student who did almost nothing formal, but was really involved with her grandparents and with spending time with them, which allowed both her parents, actually allowed her mom to take a second shift job because the grandparents really couldn't be on their own. And that's what this young woman did. But boy, did she learn a lot from that experience too. And so part of it is, how can your sons and daughters talk about any of these things in their essay, or for the schools that still offer them, in a personal interview? That's a part I didn't list on the bullets here, but certainly for the colleges that still offer personal interviews, that's another thing that would be part of holistic review.
So Terry, how well or can colleges, or do they see through things like in the recent years is a term that's become popular called a passion project, but sometimes these passion projects are really like you pay to work with, like, a PhD student, I mean, they're sure the student is doing work, but it's not completely something that they kind of initiated on their own.
Yeah, It's an interesting thing. It's a great question, and it's one of those things where I'm sure we don't see through it all. I'm sure there are times where students present something they've done and we're wowed by it, and it's not really as impressive if we really kind of talk maybe to their mom or dad about what they've been doing. But I think that what we believe typically on the admissions staff is that um, there are threads that come through in an application, and there are ways in which you can sort of say, and I'll use probably one of the best examples is a student whose essay has been over edited by an adult in their life. Is we can typically learn that because their short answer questions on their supplement are typically not written in the same voice or with the same quality. And so when you read short answer question responses that are authentic, it sometimes makes you read the essay with a more jaded eye because it doesn't seem like it's coming from the same person. So I'm sure there are times where we are impressed when we shouldn't be, but I think we'd rather that than be completely cynical about kind of the information that students provide. So the essay, as I've mentioned, and again, there are a couple things that are probably important to know about these, even if your son or daughter is applying to schools with 70% admit rates and are not going to be in situations where they feel like their essay is going to determine whether or not they might get a chance of going to that school. Certainly, even at selective colleges, the most selective ones, the essays do help distinguish among academically qualified students. But they also, at many colleges, might be part of a scholarship process. And so the student might be absolutely going to be admitted, but the strength of the essay could help them gain a scholarship of a higher amount or be competitive for a particular kind of scholarship. So an example might be a school that offers a leadership scholarship, but asks the student to write an additional essay about a specific leadership role they've held and what they learned from that. It's important for your sons or daughters to put time into those because it really could be about their financial bottom line ultimately. I think the most important thing to us is that essay is when the student has a chance to have their own voice in the process and when they get to speak for themselves and share their stories. Some students do a better job of that than others. And certainly I know Road to College has a lot of resources for students and for families around the college essay. My sort of quick advice I always give to students is tell me a story the way you would tell your parent's friend. Because you're telling the story to an adult who you may not know all that well. It's not like you're telling it to your best friend who you've known forever, but it's also not to somebody who is sitting, in a courtroom to judge you. Tell me your story the way you might tell it to a coworker or a neighbor or friend of your parents. And I think students often can then sort of understand the formality or informality that's appropriate in the college essay. So I said at the very beginning, I was going to try to help you identify colleges that are really interested in your sons and daughters. It can be a hard thing to do, but I think part of the challenge for all of us is opening our mind to the schools that we may not have ever heard of and not making an assumption that if we haven't heard of it, it must not be good. And maybe you can think about it for those of you who are music fans. When someone says to you, hey, do you like such and such musician or band? If you haven't heard of them, you don't say to yourself, well, they mustn't be good, or I would have heard of them. You say, no, I haven't heard of them. What are they like? What do you like about them? And then you go on and you listen to a song or two. And then you kind of say, oh, no, this isn't my style. This doesn't fit me. Or you might say, oh, I kind of like this. It reminds me of this other musician who I've known forever and really liked. And that's really part of the challenge. If your son says to you, I love Princeton, your your next question to your son is, what about Princeton do you love? Because if he can then tell you what things about this highly selective college he likes, then it helps you be in a position to identify what other colleges that may not be as highly selective have those similar features. So try to, again, open your mind. It's about identifying features. There are really good online free opportunities for your child or for you to go in, and you can indicate a variety of different features that you're interested in, from the location of a school to its size to majors to extracurriculars. Bigfuture.com is one, niche.com is one. I put those two on there because they immediately come to mind. I'm not saying there aren't other ones equally as good, but one of the things I like about these search sites is it allows you to say, this is absolutely important to me, or this is, it would be kind of nice to have this. But it allows you to check off, if you want to, urban and suburban, or 5,000 to 10,000 and 10,000 to 20,000. You're not being asked to pick just one answer to each of the areas, to each of the criteria that you're given.
So Terry, what would be a little bit more like deeper types of features? Yeah. Like, you know, could it be that they are required to do a senior seminar, or, yes, you know, like, you know, just like then kind of more of the top level ways that people filter.
So that those are that's would be helpful. It's things like you can find out international study. What percentage of students do, or having internships available, that's a must-have for me. Having international study available would be nice to have. Do students live on campus? Do they live on campus all 4 years? Is there a Greek system or not? Does the school offer Phi Beta Kappa or not, if that's important to your son or daughter? Can a student have 2 majors and have them in 2 different schools? So one of my favorite schools in Pennsylvania is Susquehanna University, which has a business school and an arts and science school, and you can be a history major and a marketing major. Some schools allow that, some schools don't. If you have to be affiliated with only one school. So there are a variety of things, I think, but really what you're doing initially is you're trying to have the search site serve you up the names of some schools for you to then do further investigation. Right. The easiest way to do further investigation of colleges is to go on their social media. Follow them on LinkedIn is one of my favorites, because you'll learn a lot about what their graduates are doing, what internships are happening, but also you can follow them on traditional social media like Instagram or Facebook. Check out their YouTube sites if you want to. Another easy thing to do to learn about a college is to set up, for those of you who are Google users, set up Google alerts in your emails. It's really easy to do. You can go in, you can list a dozen colleges by name, and every time, and you can either set it up so that every time that school is in the news, you'll get an alert, or you can get a weekly digest of alerts, which might make it a little bit easier to, in fact, digest. But it's a way in which you're getting information that is not admissions information marketing to your child. This is information that's out there for the world to know about a particular college. And so I think, in my mind, that gives you a different lens than if you're only getting your information curated through the admissions office. But again, the nice thing about things like social media or the Google alerts, these are free. It could be 25 colleges, it could be 50 colleges, doesn't really matter. You'll then learn, as you see some of the things coming through, that one's not really, doesn't really seem to fit. And I say you, it may be you, it may be your child doing this. But I think it's important, again, for you to learn about some schools you don't know about initially, based on the features they offer that your child has indicated are important, and then do the research about which of those schools actually seem like they might be worth a visit to the campus, to try them on for size, to see whether they might fit. I think the other big part of that is looking on their merit scholarship page and finding out what is available. There are quite a number of colleges out there that are discounting their price, their sticker price, for nearly all the students who enroll. Because in the US, nobody wants a less expensive thing at full price. People want a more expensive thing at a discount. And so the colleges respond by having a higher sticker price, but actually charging families a lower cost. This is not the case at the most popular colleges. Just remember that the most popular colleges have no need to discount that high published price. But at the colleges that are admitting 60% of their students, or 40%, or 80%, many of those places will in fact bring that published price of $60,000 maybe to $30,000 for families. And that makes a big difference for lots of families in their comfort with feeling like they can afford college, not only for child number one, but knowing they've got, child number two a couple of years younger down the road. But I think it's really, I think I said before something about popularity. A school doesn't have to be popular to be a high quality school, right? I think the popular ones are high quality. I'm not saying they're not, but there are also really high quality schools that are not as well known. And that's where I always put a lot of emphasis on investigating the record of what's their postgraduate success. Are their graduates getting jobs in the fields they're interested in? Are they helping their graduates through internship opportunities? Are they gaining access to graduate and professional schools? One way to determine quality is on what happens to the people who graduate from that college. It doesn't give you that sense of what every day is going to feel like, but it does give you a sense of at least what the outcomes are for students who have chosen that particular school.
And so obviously that information might be in the career services office. It could actually be department by department asking what they know about their graduates. But I guess what I wanted to just point out is sometimes that information is obvious. Sometimes admissions will share it. But if not, it's okay to ask these questions. It's okay to,
Yes.
Kind of dig around.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, Terry, that's officially, I know, the end of your slides, but we have a few questions I'm going to scroll back and ask. One question I saw was related to merit aid and also families having to fill out FAFSA. At some schools, they actually want you there. They require you to fill out FAFSA in order to be considered for merit scholarships. Do you have any reason why? Because usually those families aren't going to get need-based aid. So why do they have to fill out the FAFSA?
It's a good question. I think that in some cases, some of the merit scholarships at certain colleges also have outside funding, often grant funding. And so there is a responsibility to report back to the source of funds, the distribution by family income of the recipients of those merit scholarships. So even though it's meritorious in terms of how it's being determined, there's a data collection point that can be important for that continued funding. I think the other piece of it is that there are schools that I would say blur the lines of merit and need-based aid. And so there may be some schools that will say, well, this student is going to receive Pell Grant and state grant. And so in fact, they may not need as high a merit scholarship to be able to afford us as the student who may be just above the Pell eligibility on the federal dollars, and in fact need a higher merit scholarship in order to be able to afford it. It still is an odd thing to me that there are colleges that are requiring the FAFSA for merit consideration. I always recommend completing the FAFSA if you have any interest in your son or daughter, either potentially taking out a federal student loan or potentially having a job on campus. Though there are certainly colleges that allow students who are not receiving financial aid to have jobs on campus, there are many colleges where the jobs go first
Yes.
to those students who have it as part of their financial aid award, and only second to those who did not apply for aid. So there are benefits, I think, to going through that process, but there are also families for whom it's just not part of the equation, and so they should not feel like they have to complete those forms if it's something that they are confident that they have the resources, not only for that year, but for all 4 years for their son or daughter's education.
Okay. There's a question about grades and kind of this understanding that do colleges like to see a upward trend in grades, and kind of see that students are taking harder and harder classes, and what if that upward trend isn't there? How important is that?
So the way that we describe it often is that senior year of high school is the year that students are practicing for college. And so that is a year in which we are concerned about what the rigor is of their course selection, as well as the achievement they have early in that senior year, when we typically will know, not always, but know at least their first term grades before making an admission decision. I think that there is what I would describe as there's an understanding. So there is the hope, of course, that students are either have a consistently high record or that they have a positive trend. At the same time, if the student takes on greater challenge in their senior year or even in their junior year with dual enrollment or advanced placement or international baccalaureate kinds of courses, or maybe they take 2 lab sciences because that's an area that's of great interest, and maybe they go from being a straight A student to a student who has some A's and B's, that's going to be looked at. The challenge, of course, is if at the very most selective places, everybody is being compared to one another. At the schools that are selective but not highly selective, the biggest interest is that the student's doing his or her job to be well prepared to hit the ground running in their first year of college. I think the thing that's always disappointing to us is when a high school has a policy where students can really cut back senior year. And so the student really drops back to maybe only 3 academic courses senior year because they've fulfilled requirements. And what we worry about is the shock that they'll have when they are a first year student in college and suddenly the rigor is much more intense.
I'm just going to stop sharing. Terry, there's a question, and I've seen this kind of recently as a little bit of a trend. I mean, well, the trend that's been going on for several years is that students are applying to more and more colleges. That I've seen. So
Absolutely.
maybe it's been from like 6 schools that they're applying to, and it went up to like 12. But now I'm honestly seeing families ask about applying for more than 20 schools. And then when you get to that number, now there's the question of, because the Common App only lets you apply to 20. And so now you have to make a decision about which schools you're going to apply to through the Common App versus the school's individual application, if they even have it, or now the Coalition app.
Right.
Any thoughts about applying to that many schools?
So a couple of things I will mention. I worked at Ohio Wesleyan 2 years ago, and we had about 400 students apply on the Coalition app. And almost all of them were international students who were applying to more than 20 schools. And for many of them, they were very, very high need students, and they were just putting as much bread on the water as they could to try to gain access to an American college. It is my bias in some ways is that when I see a coalition app, I almost make the assumption it's because they've exhausted the 20 on the Common App, because the Common App is really the premier form that is used by so many colleges. I would never not want to take a student because of that, because if the student's terrific, I'm going to still be as interested in that young person as I would be otherwise. But it is almost a trigger in our minds. There are some colleges that have their own applications, and so that does allow a student to go beyond the 20. But here's what I would say. What typically happens when someone applies to too many colleges, however, whatever the number we might choose, is they either get into only a couple and feel miserable about all the places that denied them and have a hard time getting excited about the 3 or 4 they got into, or they get into 18 of 20 and they're in no better position than they were in the summer before senior year because they have no idea how to choose among their bounty of riches. And so it often, I think, when people apply to a whole lot of colleges, there is a sense that they're delaying the hard work of actually thinking about where they will enroll. I think I will let the parents know that what we see is when students apply late at night around the 1st of January, there's a lot of just hitting submit, submit, submit. And I think it's especially, I've heard from my secondary school counselor friends, when a student doesn't gain early admission to a school that was a dream school, they start to panic and they want to apply to maybe more schools than is wise. I don't think we should, I think every student's different and developmentally they're different and their family structure is different. So I don't want to say that there's a right number that you would apply to everyone. But I do think that being really excited about a school that you have a strong chance of being offered admission to and being able to afford, boy, if you can do that, that is really the best part of it. And for those of you with really young kids at this point, try to visit first the colleges where they are most likely to be admitted. Help them fall in love initially with a college where they're likely to get admitted. Don't take them to the most selective first, because that can often then make the other places seem less interesting. And so again, for those of you whose children are still in 9th or 10th grade, that may be helpful.
Good advice. There's a question here which I've gotten a lot about, how much do colleges compare students within the same high school versus not? Right.
So at many colleges, and this would be true both at public and private colleges, students from a similar high school, from the same high school, are reviewed by the same reader. And the practical reason for that is that that reader becomes familiar with what's available at the high school in terms of curriculum, is even able to see that, boy, there was a really tough geometry teacher who seemed to grade everybody really hard in the 10th grade. But they really are able to see trends and things at the particular school. I think back to years ago, I worked at Wesleyan University in Connecticut, and we had a year where we had 6 students from the same high school in Long Island all apply to Wesleyan. And it was sort of odd, but we ended up admitting all 6 of them. They were all 6 fabulous students, and we wanted them all. And we would have another school or another year at that same school where we would have 6 applicants and not admit any of them. And it wasn't about who's the best one of this bunch, we'll take that one and no one else. But it was, how do we envision these students contributing to our campus, and how do they fit within our overall applicant pool? But what I will say is, when there are a lot of students from the same school who apply to a college, the college typically is more aware of the fact that, gosh, AP classes are available starting in the 10th grade, and there are lots of students who are taking 2 APs each year for a total of 6 APs overall. So when you have a student who takes 1 AP and it's not 6, it's perhaps more obvious to the reader that that student hasn't challenged him or herself, may not have the same intellectual ambition that their peers do. Again, this is when we're really splitting hairs at the most selective places. But I do think we become more aware of the idiosyncrasies at schools or the opportunities at schools when there are a large number from one school who are applying.
Here's a question which I've always been kind of curious myself about. If an application is sent, like way before the deadline, particularly early decision, let's say the early decision deadline is November 1st, and a student is organized enough that they actually get it in October 15th. Do applications get started to be read early, or do they all wait until the actual deadline happens and then they look at them after?
So it is not typically the case that you're necessarily waiting till the actual deadline, but there is a start date for reading. And usually that's because there's updated reader training that goes on. It's more challenging to start early because for the schools that use admissions officers to do their primary reading, admissions officers typically in September and October are visiting high schools and representing the college at college fairs. So it is not uncommon for somewhere around the first week of November for there to be a couple of days that are marked off as reader training. And you go through some mock applications, you go through and often there's a calibration exercise around essays, so that there's definitely some work every year to refresh. At schools that do more of a rolling admission, some of that reading training might happen the first week of October. And so even though the deadline for early action may not be till November 15th, applications start being read in the middle of October, and even some decisions will get released on a rolling basis. So it's less about there being waiting till the deadline, and that October 1st student doesn't have any edge over the November 1st student. They're not necessarily read in the order in which they are received, particularly if the student attends a high school where we often get multiple applications from that high school. We'll often wait and read that group of applications together and say, okay, let's read all of the students from Madison High School today. And so, because then you can, again, get more into a rhythm of understanding the curriculum and understanding the grading system at that particular school. So it's not first come, first serve. What I always recommend for students is that they try to get their application in at least a week before the published deadline, so that if there are any glitches or any problems, there's some time for there to be communication. At the same time, there is nothing that says it's not first come, first serve. That's the best way to describe it.
Can you talk a little bit more? There's questions about GPA and students who take AP classes and unweighted GPA versus weighted GPA, and do the colleges tend to use the unweighted GPA? And if they're using the unweighted GPA, how does that fare for the student who took the harder class, because the class isn't necessarily being, you might see it as rigorous, but it's not being, included in their GPA?
So it's this is one of those answers that will likely be frustrating, but it's very much a it depends answer. And I'll use an example, and this is something that Trinity College in Hartford did at least a few years ago. I don't know whether they're still doing it. They built a formula to come up with an academic rating that included a variety of things. And one of the things it included was the unweighted GPA, but then it included a rating for rigor of curriculum. And so if a student had a certain degree of rigor, there were additional points that went into the calculation of the rating. So the student was still getting literally like objective credit for that. I think what's hard is that there's been so much pressure on high schools to do all kinds of things with their grading systems, whether it's to use a weighted system, to use an unweighted system. Probably our favorite schools are the ones that report both GPAs, the unweighted and weighted. But then it gets really complicated when you get into a student who's done 9th and 10th grade at one school, 11th and 12th grade at another. They've been at a school that uses a certain scale, and then they switch to a school that does a different scale. Homeschooled students are another group that can really be challenged by this. So we really try to, typically the goal is to try to come up with as consistent a way of treating those grades as we possibly can. It doesn't always work, but I think that there are a couple of things I would say about the rigor. One is that there, especially at colleges where there's a more reasonable number of applications in terms of ability to review them, the college with the 5,000 applications, the readers are typically more able to understand nuance than at the schools where there are 30,000 applications and you just have to go faster. And so it's not a right or wrong. It's not that the school with the 30,000 apps doesn't care as much. They simply have to accomplish their task in the same amount of time that the smaller number of app school has. And so there have to be some efficiencies.
And maybe you want to just talk a little bit to give people some reference that really, I'm going to say maybe from COVID on, from 2020 on, well, actually it came with schools going test optional, that the number of applications at some schools just exploded.
Right.
And the resources at admissions offices did not. So,
Absolutely.
you know, that's the pressure that's happening.
Right. A couple of things happened that really kind of came together. One was that, and I'll pick on the Ivy League just because that's an easy group of 8 to talk about, but the Ivy League went test optional, and that was really revolutionary in a lot of ways. So there were students who would never have thought about applying to any of those 8 schools because they're all very selective, who said, hey, I now have a chance. Test scores aren't required. I can apply to Cornell. I can apply to Brown, whichever school they wanted, or more than one. Concurrent with that was a number of those schools making really wonderful gestures about what they would do for families with incomes at a certain level. And so school counselors will say that when they have students whose family incomes are at the level where they'd pay no tuition if they went to Harvard, the students are incentivized to apply to Harvard, even when they have a record that is not going to make them pass that academic review marker that Harvard would be employing. But I understand the incentive and I don't blame the student. You've got a student coming from a family of relatively modest means who might have a chance to go to arguably, one of the top schools in the US with no tuition costs. Like, why would you not throw your hat in the ring? But it does make it very difficult. As Debbie said, the resources to review applications did not increase when those application numbers soared. I believe it's USC that gets the most applications now, and they're at something like 150,000 applications for their first year class. I think they have a staff of over 100. I think they have about 120 outside readers who read applications for them. And again, that just seems, to me, it's like being the mayor of a small town. How do you even manage a process of that size? But I think that going back to the question about test scores, I would also say that one of the things we are aware of in the admissions world is that getting even seats at testing centers on certain dates can be really, really difficult. So most colleges are still firmly committed to test optional policies, understanding that equity in terms of being able to even take the tests is really not in evidence across the country. And so that's been part of the reason for keeping the test optional policies.
There's been a few questions about supplemental essays. Like how are well, I'm just curious, like why do some colleges ask for it? And how are they really read and evaluated versus the personal statement from the Common App?
Sure. So I mentioned before that what we typically see on the supplemental essay is something that is less polished than the essay, the primary essay, primary personal statement on the Common App. And so it's not, we're not trying to have a gotcha moment with the students, but sometimes we really hear their voice more in the supplemental essays. Colleges are often criticized for the supplemental essay that asks, why are you interested in our particular school and how might you contribute? Um, I've always liked that question, frankly, because I do think it requires the student to have more than just a passing knowledge of the college and need to be able to, even if it is, you're the right size in the right location with the right majors, it's still helpful, I think, for us to hear from the student in that way. I think the way we would describe it is that the common application has really gotten sort of boiled down to bare facts in a lot of ways. And I think the supplements, whether it's supplemental essays or even just supplemental questions, bring a little more life to the student as we're reading them, and it sort of gives you the color of something that otherwise reads a little bit black and white.
Actually, I didn't realize that. Maybe if you could just answer quickly, that people didn't understand what the Coalition app is.
Oh, okay. There's an application called the Coalition for College application that is actually run by the company called SCOIR, which is SCOIR. Some of your sons and daughters probably go to high schools that use a system called Naviance, which is a way of kind of organizing their college process with their guidance counselor and with you. And some of them may go to schools that use SCORE, which is another high school based program that allows for kind of, again, the organization of information and helping school counselors, parents, and students all stay on track. The Coalition app is an application that colleges have to pay to use. The Common App is as well, but it's more expensive to do the Coalition application. It is not really very different from the Common application in terms of substance, though there are a couple of things that are not asked on the Coalition application that we sometimes are looking for. And they're also always improving it, I think. And so it is another form that some colleges offer. You can go to Coalition for College, I believe it's .org, but I'm not sure, might be .com, and you can see what colleges accept the Coalition
app. There's a section on the Common App like for additional information.
Yeah.
How do you think that students should use that best, or when should they use that?
Sure. So the additional information section on the Common application can be, I think, a really helpful thing for lots of students. So I always recommend that students who have anything that is that might cause a reader to wonder, to explain that in additional information. So I'll use the example of a student who took Spanish 2 9th grade, Spanish 3 10th grade, didn't take Spanish 11th grade, and now is taking again senior year. And maybe they want to study Spanish in college. Well, why did you have a year without Spanish? Well, the additional information place is a perfect place to say, I couldn't take Spanish my junior year because it conflicted with pre-cal. It could be, I missed 3 weeks of school in spring of 10th grade because I got a concussion in lacrosse. It could be the reason I changed schools in the middle of my 9th grade year is because my mom got transferred with her job. There are all different kinds of ways students use it, but it is often best used, I think, when students want to explain something that they maybe would explain if they were interviewing at a particular college, but it doesn't really fit anywhere else. And that's a place where it fits. Sometimes students use the additional information section if they have their own website or they're on YouTube with a particular, maybe their mock trial's got a YouTube a video. And so they'll put the URL there, and just sort of say, if you're interested in seeing how our team did on mock trial, you can go to this URL. But there are lots of students, I would say probably more than 50%, maybe more than 60%, don't put anything there. So it's not something where your children should feel like, I have to put something in additional information. It's really there for them to share something about themselves that may not be evident in another part of their application.
Okay, last question, because you've been so generous in answering so many questions. There's been a lot of comments about what grades do schools see, particularly if the student is applying early, or whether it's early decision, early admission. They're going to be applying before the first semester grades are done. So in theory, the admissions offices aren't going to see those grades, but do they see grades later in the year, and do those ever have impact on a decision?
So there are more and more schools that are making admissions decisions early in the fall of the senior year. And so senior grades are not available. Occasionally we will have either first marking period or first quarter grades. There are times where we will actually ask a student to send us a screenshot of their grade report. Maybe they've been on an upward trend after a rocky start in 9th grade, and we just want to see that that's continuing senior year, at least in the first quarter. The students and their counselor, I believe on the Common App, both sign a statement, but the counselor I know does, saying that if there's any change to the schedule or any change to the student's enrollment in school, it will be reported. So it is important that the student not say that they're taking, BC Calculus and AP Physics and French 5 and lots of other things when they apply in August, only then to go into school the first week of September and suddenly change their record. Because at that point, typically the school report won't have gone in yet, the high school report, and they are sending us the senior list of courses as well as the student self-reporting them. We've always recommended for students who get admitted early decision that if they're going to, they want to drop a course that they were planning to take in the spring semester, that they contact the college to ask about that. In my situation, almost always it's been something we've approved. In a couple of cases, it wasn't. I can remember a specific case where a student said, I don't think I want to continue with this course second semester because I don't care for the teacher's teaching style. And we said, there are going to be professors you have in college where you're not going to care for their teaching style either. Stick it out. And so it is important, though, because we do, technically by law, at least in a lot of cases for US students, we have to see their proof of graduation and their final high school transcript with date of graduation on it. If there is a considerable difference between their final high school transcript and what we saw earlier on, there will likely be some follow-up and conversation. It is not the case that very often offers of admission are pulled, but it is the case that every year some of them are. It is more often that they're pulled for significant rule infractions than it is for dropping grades. But I can think of one particular case where a student really went off the rails and really went from being primarily an A student to finishing senior year with pretty much all D's. And that student was clearly not ready to start college that next fall. And there were not extenuating circumstances, which are always investigated. But yes, if the courses change or the grades of senior year are considerably different than the grades of 11th grade, it's important for students to be proactive about being in touch with the colleges.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Terry. It's a little after 10. Thanks for everybody who's hung on this late. We all need to kind of wind down and get to sleep.
Yes.
So there were a lot of people who have said thank you. So, and I'm just going to say it again. Thank you, Terry, for sharing all of your knowledge. It's so helpful to just hear what you have to say and answer these questions, and just know you've been through so many different situations and in the admissions world for a long time. I won't mention how many years. You can keep that to yourself.
And I would just say, as the last word, remember, it's over a 60% admission rate at private colleges in the United States. There are lots of fabulous places that just aren't the most popular.
Yeah.
And so don't confuse popularity as being the factor for quality. Lots of places that admit a high percentage of students will also be wonderful places for your sons and daughters.
Great advice. Okay, everybody.
Thank you.
Good night. And sure, we'll see you again soon. Bye.
Bye.